Hello and welcome to this evening's discussion hosted by the Regional Transportation District. My name is Kaylee Showers. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to be the moderator tonight as we discuss the RTD Fare Study and Equity Analysis. If you joined us at the kickoff meeting a couple months ago, welcome back. And if tonight is your first engagement with this process, thank you so much for being here. We have got a stacked agenda this evening. Since we met in April, the project team has been hard at work. We have heard from thousands of community members since we launched this process. And tonight you'll be hearing from project team members and transit experts who will be providing an overview of the study, an update on the timeline, what we've heard so far, what's being considered and what's not, and next steps and how to stay engaged. We have 2 breaks where we'll take your questions. And for my first of many plugs this evening, we welcome you to begin entering your questions into the Zoom Q&A box starting right now. It is our goal to ask as many of your pressing questions as we possibly can. If you're joining us on the phone line this evening, welcome. We'll be verbally sharing all of tonight's information so you can stay informed, and we will share a variety of channels that you can submit your questions following the meeting tonight. With that, I want to take a moment to introduce a few key members of our project team. Tonight, you'll be hearing from RTD project managers Chris Quinn and Carl Green, along with the consultant team project manager Laurel Wolfgram. In addition, I'm joined by many others behind the scenes from the project team who are here to support in answering the community's questions. Before I pass things over to Chris to get us started, I want to share a couple quick housekeeping items and instructions on how to participate in tonight's discussion. As I just mentioned, if you're joining us online this evening, you can begin entering your questions and comments into the Zoom Q&A box now. We'll be getting to as many of those questions as we possibly can during our time together. If you're phoning in, we'll share several ways for you to submit your questions and to stay engaged in the process at the end of the discussion. If you'd like to answer your question or ask your question rather out loud, you can utilize the raise hand function, which can be accessed going to the reaction button on the bottom of your screen. If you are selected to ask your question out loud, we will enable you to unmute and we'll call your name. We are so pleased to see how many people are joining us already this evening. We will try to promote as many of you as possible to answer your questions out loud. We will be limiting the verbal questions to the question and answer breaks only. Finally, we have 2 polling questions that we want to ask you this evening, and we'll be launching those for our online participants in just a moment. When we launch the polls, a pop-up screen will appear on your devices and you will be allowed to submit your response. So on that note, my colleague Sid is going to get us going with the polling now. All right, you should see the pop-up in front of you. Our first polling question of the evening asks what county you live in. So you should see that on your screen. We'll give everyone a few moments to answer. While your responses are coming through, and just so you know why we ask this question, this is because RTD is committed to engaging with the community to ensure that a diverse array of voices are heard in this process. If you didn't know, RTD serves the transit needs of over 3 million people within an 8-county service area in Colorado. So as you wrap up your answers to our first polling question, know that we ask this to better understand who we're reaching and if we're succeeding in our objective to hear from community members across the service area. So give everyone else a couple more moments to join and answer. I'll share the results in just a moment when we close out this first question. All right, we're going to close this poll. You should all be able to see the results in front of you. And for those calling in, I'll share out. Looks like Denver is very well represented tonight with 42% of our participants joining from the Mile High City. We've got Arapahoe County representing in second with 17%. But so happy to see we've got a well-attended meeting tonight with people joining from all over the service area. So thank you for participating in our first poll. For our second and final polling question of the evening, we want to know if you attended our first customer and community meeting in April, or if this is the first time you're engaging in a meeting for the Fare Study and Equity Analysis. So quick and simple quiz, just yes or no if you attended the April meeting. Give a few moments for everyone to answer. All right, let's close it down and I'll share the results. It looks like we're pretty evenly spread. So 32% of you did participate in the first meeting in April. Thank you so much and welcome back. 68% of you are joining for the first time, and that is great because we're about to get started and get into the juicy details of the meeting tonight. So with that, I'm going to welcome Chris Quinn, who will get us started with an overview on this study. Chris?
Okay, next slide, please. And the next. So just a real quick introduction, since it does look like there are a considerable number of new attendees to this meeting that weren't at the last meeting. Why is RTD conducting yet another FAIR study? Well, we have heard repeatedly from our customers that our FAIR system is too complicated, too expensive. And so we'd like to use this as an opportunity to explore how we can simplify our FAIRs. How can we make RTD services more equitable and easier to understand? And also, how can we align FAIRs with services, our FAIRs with the service and the value that's provided with that service? So as part of this effort, we are in fact considering lowering FAIR revenues. That is to say, in the past, we've always had a FAIR revenue target to try to make sure that FAIRs covered a certain proportion of our service costs. We are not going into this study with any specific target, so we do have a lot more flexibility than we have with the past efforts that we've done for our FAIR studies and analyses. Now, what is the study timeline? We started the study very late end of last year, early this year. And then in the spring, we started our public outreach community engagement process. We did have a couple of meetings, as Kaylee mentioned, in the April timeframe. And that's where we were introducing the study to the public and also just trying to get some real general feedback on what the public liked, disliked about the current FAIRs. Now that we're into summer, where you see the arrow, this is our current stage, and this is our second round of community engagement. And this is where we want to introduce high-level conceptual FAIR structural options and get your feedback on those before we go back to to consider what those look like. Towards the fall timeframe, that's where we'll come back with some more finalized alternatives. And then going into fall and winter, we will have a series of public hearings on the final alternatives with the intent of going to the RTD Board of Directors sometime in the spring timeframe, roughly April-ish, to adopt with the final recommendations. So from a time standpoint, we hope to have this effort completed before this time next year. Next slide, please. For the goals of the study, the overarching goal that we have is equity. And by that, we mean supporting transit-reliant or financially burdened customers, and also to make sure that we provide equitable and fair access to all with our FAIRs, products, and discounts, regardless of race, color, national origin, income status, and for other marginalized communities. Under that, we also have affordability. So obvious what that means, making sure that we align the FAIRs with the value of the service received, and then also simplicity, just to make sure that the system is more understandable than it is now. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about when we're talking about FAIRs? When you board a bus, train, you are required to have a FAIR. The FAIR is used to cover some of the operating costs of operating the system. Now, we do want to emphasize that FAIRs do not cover the entire operational costs of running RTD. RTD also receives, we receive sales tax revenue as well as some federal operating assistance grants. So FAIRs only cover a portion of the total cost, but we do want to emphasize that it is still it's still an important part of covering the cost to run the system. Next slide. So what have we heard so far? I'm going to hand off to my colleague, Carl Green, to discuss that component.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Carl Green Jr., and for folks that just called in or are in this virtual meeting, I am the Deputy Project Manager for the Fair Study and Equity Analysis. So as Chris alluded to, so what have we heard so far? So in line with our commitment to ensuring a community and customer-centric approach to this study, I can say with full confidence that we've met that moment. So what this slide here represents is a 40,000 foot view of all the engagement efforts as it relates to milestone number 1. And what I can say is that there was a full court press made up of RTD staff, project consultants, and community partners that took on a multifaceted and robust approach to our engagement milestone. That took place again back in April and May. And just to give you an overview, ranging from left to right, we launched a website back in April. And the thing to note, given that we're still in COVID times, this was an epicenter, if you will, for all the information that we can relay to the public and our customers. And just to give you a few stats, we've had over 2,000 unique views of our website and over 36,000 social media impressions, whether it's on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And one thing that I wanted to highlight too is that we created a Spanish version of our webpage in order to afford that opportunity for our folks that dominant language is in Spanish. And then we also provided a number of different study materials for folks that are English language learners focusing on Spanish, but also opening up to our other 20 languages that we consider safe harbor languages. And then in addition to that, we've held, again, last month, back in May, we had customer and community meetings where we had 2 of them. Both were held virtually, and we had over 100 attendees where we had one focused in on English and the other in Spanish. Moving to the right, community partner and focus groups, where we had the privilege to work with 6 community partners, whether it was Athletics and Beyond, Cultivando, Una Mano Una Esperanza, Denver Street Partnerships, Focus Reentry, and Crea Results, where they led focus groups both in English and Spanish, and we had over 100 attendees participate in these focus groups. We also had feedback panels meetings where it was focused on equity, an equity feedback panel, past programs, and jurisdictional partners. And we also launched a survey where we had over 2,400 respondents, and these were conducted both in online and in person by our community partners. And we also provided the opportunity to ensure accessibility as it relates to languages in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese, in addition to having it primarily in English. And then also equally as important of collecting this customer and community feedback is to look inward to provide interviews with our staff across the agency, where we held 13 interviews across the agency, as I mentioned. And then we also had specific focus groups to take a deeper dive as it relates to our customer care staff, our bus and rail operators, and in addition to that, our transit security officers. So what you can see before you here is at the 40,000 foot view, but what it doesn't necessarily tell you is the countless hours of communication and coordination across the team here. And it's just so great to be able to see that it's a testament of what RTD is delivering as far as meeting the moment as it relates to community and customer engagement. Next slide. So again, after we completed engagement milestone number 1, there was a lot of coordination and compiling of information of what we have heard across the different outlets, if you will, of engagement from the surveys, the customer and community meetings, the equity feedback or the feedback panels, and so forth. And these were the common themes that were apparent across these groups, if you will. And just to read off, financially burdened customers should pay less than higher income customers. Fares are too expensive. There's too many fare products and discount levels. There's confusion surrounding the fare levels from local, regional to airport. There's an inconvenience to purchase passes, inability to purchase monthly passes. Let's see what else. Service more important than affordable fares, potential fare study impacts on paratransit. And then there's overall support for higher fares for longer distance trips. And then others support same fare for all bus and rail. And then limited interest in higher fares during busier times and lower fares during midday and weekends. And then lastly, there's a diminishing value associated with RTD services, i.e. less frequent, reliable service, and concerns about overall safety and cleanliness. So that is the overarching themes that was apparent across the interviews and surveys and so forth. So now we'll get into the next slide, which is the suggestion. So as Chris mentioned, as we filtered through the information, and what we're looking at tonight specifically is what are some potential suggestions as we look at conceptual fare options. So what was present, or prevalent rather, was reducing or eliminating fares, but with the caveat to without reducing service, offering a single flat fare, decreasing shorter trip fares, consolidating all of our discounts, to promoting technology to simplify fare payment while recognizing some lack of technology access across our different customer segments, rewarding frequent travelers with discounts, implementing fare capping, providing lower fares for financially burdened customers, providing youth or financially burdened customers with free fares, reducing barriers to live and discount fares, providing a college student discount to lower airport fares specifically for airport employees, offering a family fare, and then lastly, identifying new revenue sources outside of our fares to offset the costs related to reducing or eliminating fares. So on that note, that is the list of suggestions that were prevalent. Again, there was a laundry list of suggestions, and we took all the input and feedback into consideration, but this is at a high level, some of the suggestions that we wanted to make note for you all tonight. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass it over to
me. I think I'll take it back. Thanks, Carl. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chris. We will be pausing in just a moment for our first Q&A break. Until then, please continue to add your questions in the Q&A box. But with that, I would like to pass the mic over to Laura Wolfram, who will be sharing with you all methods of the study, the evaluation process, and much more. Laura?
Great. So if we go to the next slide, it kind of illustrates how all of your feedback that we've received so far, as well as feedback later on throughout the study, will really kind of guide and inform our study. One of the major components is really to evaluate the alternatives. How do they achieve the study goals that Chris outlined earlier, but also understand kind of how they meet your needs. And so your input is going to be very valuable here as we kind of assess some of the trade-offs among them. So your customer feedback is integral to this process. We are watching a lot of Q&A questions come in. We got a lot of feedback also during the first engagement milestone. We took a lot of that feedback from that milestone to help identify conceptual fare options that we'll be discussing in the second half of this presentation, which will actually answer maybe some of the questions that some of you guys have of where are we going, what are we thinking about. From kind of the feedback we're getting today, as well as kind of feedback that we got in the first milestone, we'll start kind of crafting and structuring or putting together some fare structure alternatives that we will be evaluating and sharing you the technical evaluation process and results in the fall timeframe. And so we look forward to sharing that information and using some of that information to really start forming the recommendations that RTD will take to its board. And then again, you'll have another opportunity as part of the public comment and hearing process to provide additional feedback on the recommendation as well. So your feedback is critical to the study. It helps us understand what your needs are, how some of these options and alternatives may or may not meet your needs. So as part of this evaluation on the next slide, there are really 5 key elements. The first is really the consideration of your feedback, as I discussed on the prior slide. But we'll also be kind of taking a look at some technical components. So how do the fare structure alternatives that we're crafting meet the study goals? What are the advantages, disadvantages? What are the trade-offs among them? This will also include fare modeling to determine pricing, to really understand the project, the projected ridership and revenue of the fare changes. As part of this modeling, we'll segment ridership into different customer groups to really assess how different groups will be impacted, how they might respond to the different fare changes based off of their price sensitivities. also known as like fare elasticities. Modeling will be very helpful also in determining kind of pricing and comparing the ridership and revenue impacts among the alternatives. The output of that modeling will be really critical for the next component, which is really the preliminary equity analysis. This is kind of a key principle for RTD. Part of their mission is to provide equitable service throughout the Denver metro area. In addition, as a federal grant recipient, RTD is required to conduct fare equity analyses of any proposed fare changes. So as part of this process to really bring equity earlier in the study, we'll be conducting preliminary equity analyses of the alternatives to assess whether the proposed changes might have a disparate impact on minority populations or disproportionate burden on low-income populations. And a part of this will be really kind of an average fare analysis to really understand some of those cumulative impacts of how the proposed fare changes might impact minority and low-income customers in a negative way, as well as also understanding some of the benefits associated with that. And then the last component of the technical analysis is really consideration of the operational, technology, and capital impacts. As alternatives are considered, it'll be important to identify some of the implementation challenges early on in the study. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Keely to start Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you all for staying so engaged in this process. So now it's time for us to answer your questions. So again, as just a reminder, you go to the Q&A box icon. If you're on an online device, you can enter in your comments and questions. We'll be answering as many as we can throughout the evening. So I'm going to get started. And Chris, I'm looking to you to answer our first question. Could you tell us what are the arguments against a single system-wide fare? This participant said, with the possible exception of DEN or the Denver International Airport, but then again, why? Zoned approach doesn't seem to be in line with what is going on US or even globally.
Yeah, so as part of this process, we are in fact looking at the possibility of eliminating the fare zones. Now, I do want to emphasize, though, that there are other systems that do have distance-based fares. One of the things, of course, that does make it simpler in other systems, and I'm just going to pull, say, Washington, D.C. Metro as an example. One of the big differences between us and them is they do have the gates in the stations. So, you can't get out unless you have paid the sufficient fare. Obviously, we have a completely open system, so that does add to the complexity of both fare enforcement and the fact that geographically we do span a huge area. So there are arguments that if I'm traveling from, say, Brighton to Denver, maybe I should be paying more than somebody who's just getting on East Colfax at Steel Street and riding into downtown Denver. So, there are good arguments for having it, not having it. But as I noted at the beginning, that is something that we are considering, just having what we're calling a flat fare, so to speak. So thanks for that question.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And before you go back to mute, I'm coming over to you with one more. One of our participants asked, will you be considering reducing EcoPass costs in this process? Yeah, so one of the components that we're dealing with also is not only just looking at the basic fares, but also the pass programs as well. What are the things that we could do to simplify those, streamline some of the discounts? And included within that is looking at in detail how we can maybe get the Nico Pass system to work a little bit better. Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. Carl, I'd like to bring this one over to you. We're receiving quite a few questions about free fares, whether those are even going to be considered, especially for youth or those under 18. Can you comment on this or speak more to that topic?
Yeah, so what I can say, a suggestion or consideration or a conceptual option that we are taking into consideration, as noted in a few slides ago, is looking at potential offering free fares for youth or transit reliant or financially burdened. So that's something that's in consideration that we are working through to see if that is feasible for us to move forward with. So it is being explored.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carl. I'm gonna give the project team a moment to relax and answer this next question. One of our participants asked, how do I get on notifications about future project work? And there are quite a few channels to do so. And we love that you're engaged and interested to stay engaged in this process. So we will leave everyone with next steps and how to stay engaged. And I'll make sure to drop links to the project website and the email in the chat. But if you go to the project website, and for those of you phoning in on the line, that website is rtd-denver.com/fair study. There is a comment form where you can stay up to date. You can leave your questions and comments if we don't get through all of them tonight, and get alerts on future project updates. Now I want to ask the person who has their hand up. I believe one of our participants, Jeanette, is on the line. I'd like to promote her to unmute herself and ask her question out loud. The floor is yours, Jeanette. You should be able to answer or speak out loud now. Jeanette, are you still here with us?
Am.
Yay, we can hear you.
Thank you. My question is, are you looking at, I'm a senior citizen. Are you looking, and I know that there are fare reductions for the seniors, but a lot of times we need to go somewhere, but we can't get from point A to point B without having a lot of cost. I know we can do the Access-a-Ride and so on, but like to get to the train and so on like that. Are they looking at trying to maybe make a package out of that?
Thank you for the question, Jeanette. Chris, I'd like to pass that over to you first, but any of the project team members feel free to respond.
Yeah, so we're not directly looking at the Access-a-Ride fares. The way it just as and I think you suggested this, Jeanette, when you were in your question, we currently do have discount fares for seniors right now. It's half the cost of a fare for whatever the base fare would be otherwise. What we are looking at the implications of let me reframe that. As we go through the study, the way it works from a federal standpoint is for Access-a-Ride, the fares cannot exceed, I believe it's twice whatever the base fare would be. So in this case, while we're not specifically looking at excessive fare cost, we are trying to determine how it would play in to whatever fare structure that we come up with as part of this study. So it's kind of within our orbit, but it's not the focus of what we're looking at right now, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Chris. Anyone else from the project team want to respond to Jeanette, or we can move on? All right, for this next one, we're going to have time for just a few more. One of the participants asked, how essential or integral are fares to RTD's operational costs? You know, we might get into this later on in the discussion, but Chris, I might pass that back over to you.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers on the top of my head. So if there is somebody else in the panel that does know that, one of the things I do want to emphasize, and we sort of talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, previously the state of Colorado actually had what we call a fare box requirement ratio. So that meant that a certain percentage of RTD's operations had to be covered by fares. House Bill, I believe it was 1186 from about a year ago, eliminated that requirement. So we do have a lot more flexibility now. I see Bill has turned his camera on, so I'm hoping maybe he has a better sense of what the actual percentage breakdown of the operating costs are.
Sure. Again, this is Bill Saroy. Just a little bit, and there was another question or two in the Q&A about kind of what is our fare revenue. So currently, or actually pre-COVID, fare revenue represent about 15%, 15 to 20% of our operating budget. It varied a little bit year to year, but post-COVID, it has gone down. Now it's really more, I would say, 8 to 12%. So, you know, gone down fairly significantly. Our primary revenue source is sales tax. That represents about 60% of our revenues. We do get additional revenues from grants, either federal grants or other types of grants, formula grants, and that's 20, in some cases 25%, because we've gotten some COVID relief funding recently. And then we have some ancillary other revenues like advertisements and other that represent a smaller percentage. So if you think about fairs today, currently they're 8 to 12% essentially of our operating budget.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bill. Carl, I saw you unmute. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, Bill hit the nail on the head. I was just going to say that. Thank you, Bill.
Awesome. Thank you both. I think we have time for one more question for this break, but we do have a much longer break at the end of this discussion. And so please keep those questions rolling through. Really appreciate you all staying engaged. For this one, this is kind of going off of what we discussed earlier with the EcoPass. So I might look to you again, Carl, for this one, but any of the project team members, please feel free to jump in. One of the participants wants to know, is RTD considering changes to EcoPass to encourage more employers of especially essential workers to participate? The participant notes it's a great program. It seems like it's mostly, though, catered towards large companies, offices, universities, while few employers of hourly workers like warehouses, restaurants, retail offer it due to the upfront cost. Carl, Chris, Bill.
Okay. Sorry for the pause there. Yeah, as I noted earlier, yeah, we do recognize that the EcoPass is an extremely popular program, and the people who have it really seem to like it, but also recognize some of the barriers of entering into that program. So as part of this study, as Carl noted earlier, we do have specific feedback panels. One of those is a PASS working group panel, and it includes colleges, universities, employers, employment centers, and we have also included on that, as an example, some of the colleges that don't participate in any of our PASS programs, to kind of get a better sense of, okay, not only what works, but what doesn't work. So with the intent of seeing what we can do to broaden the eligibility or make it more user friendly, so to speak, or easier to obtain for other employers besides, like you said, just the larger downtown employees. So
thank you, Chris, and thank you all again for the questions and for staying engaged in this process. Again, we'll have another moment, much longer, to end with your questions. But now we want to get into what is being considered and what is on the table with this process. So Chris, you're going to have to stay unmuted for this one, buddy. I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Hit the mute button too quickly. Yeah. So yeah, in this next section, we'll talk about what is being considered, what is not being considered, and then some of the other things that are going on related to that. So next slide, please. So what is being considered? Carl went over what we had heard at our first public engagement meeting, and one of the big things that we've heard is that the fares are too expensive. So obviously we are considering lowering fares, simplifying the fares, and as the questioner brought up earlier, are we considering a flat fare so that we eliminate the fare boundaries? Yes, that is something else we are also considering. And then we are also seeing, is there a way that we can reward frequent customers, whether that's through, say, reducing the monthly pass pricing or offering, say, a weekly fare cap instead of a monthly fare cap. Or even we did have questions about introducing what we used to have years ago, which was called an annual pass. So you pay up front for the entire year. Also, we've received a couple of questions just within this meeting on the EcoPass. Are there ways that we can streamline the eligibility to EcoPass? And also, is there a way for us to simplify the pass programs that are out there, since we have such a variety of them, but some of them offer different levels of discount? So there again, what can we do to really simplify that and make allow more people to be eligible for those? We're also looking at ways that we can leverage technology to simplify the fare payment. And Laura is going to talk in just on the next couple of slides about some of the things that are going on right now related to our account-based ticketing and fare capping. And then Also, what can we do to address the challenges of some of our unique subsets of customers, whether that's families, college students, airport employees, but want to really do a deep dive into what certain needs are for some of our specific ridership groups. We also want to, as I said earlier, explore ways that we might be able to simplify the past programs and maybe even expand those. Recognizing here again, though, that we do need, in the case of, say, the EcoPass, we have what we call utilization-based pricing. So we do need to make sure that we do get some fair revenue out of these. So we always have to have that in the background, but what can we do to simplify the whole process? And then also, is there a way for us to promote bulk purchases here again for companies that want to buy passes for individuals or nonprofits that could use that? And then related to that, obviously also simplifying our nonprofit program to allow them to buy tickets maybe at a reduced rates to help their clients and the populations that they serve. And then lastly, going back to what one of the previous questions that had come up from, I think, Jeanette, what are the implications of any of our fare changes to the Access-a-Ride fares that are out there currently? So those are the things that we are looking at. And now on the next slide, we'll show some of the things that we probably won't be looking at. So next slide, please. So at this point, we will not be looking at the elimination of all fares. Now, as Bill Soroy did mention earlier, fares cover, depending, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, or I guess current pandemic, roughly, say 10% of our operating costs, recognizing that even though that's a relatively small percentage, if we were to have, say, and it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio, but if we were to have a corresponding cut in service of, say, 10%, that would be pretty significant. So not something that we would consider at this point. Also, as part of this study, we were not charged with trying to come up with a way to find new revenues that could cover those. It's something we're always looking for new sources of revenue, anything that we can find, but it's not something that we've been able to identify at this point. And tied in with that, as I said, we don't want, we have a lot more flexibility now that the state statute has removed our fare box recovery ratios, but we still don't want to reduce fares to such a point that we have to then implement service reductions. So we really would like to keep the service that is out there now, or even be able to expand it, but we don't want to have reductions. We also, at this point, we are not, and this was a question that had come up at, I think, one of the first public meetings that we had, broadened discount eligible categories, such as for pollution impacted communities, or increasing the youth age all the way up to 26. Then there were some other categories that we were looking at that, while not necessarily outside the scope of the study, could be difficult to implement. So we did have some suggestions on always keeping the fares within $1 increments. That is something we probably can't do, but we definitely want to keep in mind, the difficulty of having a fare that's, say, $2.95. That's something we certainly wouldn't do. We want to keep it relatively simple, but we can't necessarily commit to full dollar increments. Also, we had questions on whether it'd be possible to introduce what would be called kind of a rolling 24-hour pass or a rolling 30-day pass. So such that, if I buy a day pass or a 24-hour pass at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it is then good until 3 o'clock the next day. We found that in looking at some, that we would have some pretty serious technological challenges with that at this point. Not to say that that's not something that could be done in the future, but right now, given the existing technology and limitations we have, that could be not something that we could easily implement. Also, something that we wouldn't be able to implement is, there are people that will often buy get a 30-day pass, and then for whatever reason, they're not able to use, for whatever reason, they were sick for 2 weeks or something. We pretty much don't have the ability to refund for those rides not taken. Now, some of the things that we were looking at in other ways, so being not necessarily considered on their own, is while we don't think we would be offering a family fare product, we do want to look at ways, are we able to reduce, and currently we do have some pretty significant discounts for youth, but are there ways that a family pass can be addressed through, as it is now, the reduced the youth discounts, and then currently children 5 and under can ride for free. So keeping those things in mind when we're thinking about what a family pass could be. Also, we don't want to introduce significant changes to either the 3-hour or day passes. And then we did hear also from people, but it didn't seem to have much interest on lowering the fares in the midday and on weekends. That is something we did way back in the 70s, but there didn't seem to be much interest in reopening that at this point. And then also seemed to be also limited interest in pricing fares based on the amenities offered by the particular service. So, and then on the next slide, Laura is going to jump back in on.
Great. Yeah. So now we're going to present on a few of the options being implemented or considered. And I think, again, there's been some questions that we've been receiving about My Ride. So this has a direct implication on that. First, I'm going to start talking about the new fare collection system, and then we're going to talk a little bit about, simplifying the fare structure, which was some of the comments and questions we got earlier. And then also talk about some streamlining of the discount fare options that are being considered. So as some of you may know, RTD is in the process of upgrading its My Ride stored value card, as well as its RTD mobile tickets app, with an account-based ticketing system, also referred to as ABT. And this will really enhance the customer experience. It provides you with real-time access to your funds. It will also offer fare capping, which is something that we've heard a lot of interest in, and we'll talk about on the next slide. But there's a lot of benefits of this program. While we aren't necessarily looking at things of, refunding you for what you've used, the stored value only charges you for the rides that you take. And so there are a lot of benefits of this system. You'll also be able to use either your smart card or your phone. There will be like a QR code that will come up on your phone that you will be able to scan on the new validators. These new validators are being prepared for installation later this summer. And so RTD is planning to launch the new system later this year. So, look out for some new information. Both will kind of keep you updated on ABT as part of this project, but also keep an eye on the RTD website. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that RTD has been asked for many years now has been fare capping. It's relatively a new feature that a lot of newer fare collection systems offer. Fare capping is a fare policy that ensures customers using electronic fare media always pay the best fare. So as part of fare capping, the system will actually automatically apply the fares purchased towards a period pass. So in RTD's case, the system will accumulate fares based on the fares paid, so that customers using the new ABT system never pay more than the equivalent of the appropriate 3-hour pass, day pass, or monthly pass based on the services used and the number of trips taken by the customer. RTD will be specifically offering daily fare capping that's based on a service day. Rolling fare capping really is a problematic thing, and kind of Chris was alluding to it a little bit earlier. RTD will also be kind of sticking with a calendar monthly fare cap. It's much easier to explain. It aligns with also the paper fare products that RTD offers. And one thing to note is that, one question I often get from people at other agencies is, will fare capping take into account if I'm eligible for a discount? And the answer is yes. So each, you'll have to have a separate card or account to be able to use ABT. You'll set up an entitlement on the account. So if you're, for example, a senior, you would have to set up your account using your birth date to kind of set up the system so that it knows what the correct fare is to deduct and what is the correct fare cap to apply based off of your discount category. As part of this transition, right now there's a MyRide stored value discount. MyRide doesn't have a day pass, it doesn't have a monthly pass. So kind of you're really just paying on a 3-hour pass trip by trip, with going to fare capping to really make it a little bit simpler. RTD will be getting rid of the MyRide stored value discount when they launch the new system. That's in part because the day pass, for example, is priced at twice the 3-hour pass. So you won't have these weird increments being deducted. Fare capping really addresses a lot of the concerns and challenges that we heard during the first engagement. Fare capping will remove the financial barrier for monthly passes. You don't have to come up with all of the money up front. You're able to pay for the monthly pass over the course of the month. So really kind of helps eliminate that financial barrier. It also simplifies fare payment and selection. Instead of customers determining which pass to purchase up front, the fare collection system actually determines based off of the customer's travel patterns the best fare. No need to pick up front. So for example, let's say you bought a 3-hour pass and you end up deciding to make another trip that day, the system will automatically cap you out at the daily pass price. You didn't have to necessarily know what your trip making patterns are going to be over the course of the day. And I think another great feature of fare capping is, currently Live customers don't have a monthly pass available for them, but with the launch of ABT, Live customers will now also be able to benefit from both daily and monthly fare capping. So the next slide, we're kind of going to talk about some of the conceptual options being considered related to the simplification of the fare structure, as well as the streamlining of the discounts. So RTD's fare structure is complex, we heard you, but it really enables RTD to price fares based on the distance traveled. RTD has 3 fare levels: local, regional, and airport. And on the rail system, the number of zones traveled helps determine the appropriate fare level. And any travel that you enter into the airport zone on rail requires an airport fare. Some of the complexities introduced because bus routes do not utilize zones. They're distance based on some of the routes. So there are regional and SkyRide bus routes that have a higher fare. And whether or not that higher fare applies depends on how far you are traveling on that route. And then in addition, whether or not the airport fare actually applies on buses is also not necessarily determined by a hard boundary, but is actually determined by the service standards for that bus route. So there are 2 bus routes that are currently serving the airport, for example, that are local. On the next slide, some of the general feedback from customers is that the fare structure is confusing. But as we asked customers about their preferences, there was really mixed feedback on whether RTD should keep the current fare structure with the different fare levels or whether RTD should flatten fares. So as the conceptual options were being defined, and we worked with RTD service planners to really understand, are there modifications that we might want to make to the current zone boundaries, for example. It was clear no matter what we did, we wanted to evaluate the current structure as well as maybe a flat fare structure. And so we're going to be looking at some different options, whether that's retaining the current fare structure, eliminating maybe the distance-based fares on bus. So maybe the rail retains zones, but bus is completely flat at the local fare, or possibly SkyRide fare for any trips that maybe go to the airport. We'll also be looking at what if both bus and rail are flat with 1 fare, regardless of whether or not you go to the airport. But also looking at maybe going to have an airport premium with a flat fare for all other travel. It's a much easier fare structure to explain because it's kind of a known destination. This is kind of where we really will start having a lot of trade-offs from a pricing perspective. Fare modeling is going to be very informative in evaluating the trade-off among these options. By charging a higher regional and airport fare, RTD is able to really have a lower local fare. And so by lowering the regional and airport fare and maybe going to a flat fare structure, it will result in a decrease in fare revenue that may limit RTD's ability to lower the local fare. Other things that need to be considered is lowering, the regional and airport fare, for example, and going to a flat fare structure might increase demand. And so that might strain capacity on some routes. It may also cause some parking capacity issues and some park and rides. There also might be some dwell time impacts as people are kind of maybe making more frequent trips. So all of these externalities, in addition to the ridership and revenue implications and the pricing considerations, they'll all need to be considered as we're evaluating kind of these different fare structure options. So the last set of conceptual options that will be presented today are related to discount fares. So RTD has different discount levels with different eligibility requirements and application processes. So there are differences also between what customers can use as a proof of eligibility when riding. So youth and seniors, for example, are able to provide other forms of identification to provide proof of age. While the discounts really can be confusing in general, a lot of the feedback received was customers and stakeholders are really supportive of RTD offering different discounts to a variety of types of customers who may be financially burdened or transit reliant. Discount fares were really overall viewed as promoting equity. There was a lot of feedback related to trying to increase the live discount to align with the federally mandated half fare for seniors and individuals with disabilities, as well as increasing the accessibility to the live program. And then there was also, it was mixed results, but there was some support for reducing the number of discount levels with a sentiment that one discount level could simplify messaging and product sales. But as we discussed on the next slide, there's a lot of trade-offs between different ways that you could consolidate the different discounts. So based on this feedback, a variety of different conceptual options are being considered. The first is kind of the simplest option, which is increasing the live discount from 40% to 50% to align with the discount fare category for seniors and individuals with disabilities. The next is aligning all discount eligible customer or discount levels at 50%, which would result in a reduction in the discount for youth who currently receive a 70% discount, which did pose some concerns among RTD staff that we'll have to consider. The third option aligns the discount levels, but also offers a greater discount on the monthly pass, such as a 50% discount on a 3-hour pass and a day pass, and a 70% discount, for example, on a monthly pass. This provides the greatest financial relief to RTD's most frequent customers. It also helps minimize, the reduction in the discount for youth, since basically their monthly pass price would not necessarily change, and if fares were lowered, would actually go down. The fourth option really aligns the discounts, but eliminates the higher fare for regional and airport trips for discount customers. So instead, all discount fares would be based on 50% of the local fare so that it could comply with some federal regulations. This option would retain the current fare structure for full fare customers, but is really focused on how do we, take the funds that we can maybe allocate and provide the greatest discount to those who maybe need the most assistance. And so this kind of promotes access to customers to new destinations throughout the region by removing some of those financial barriers associated with the regional and airport fare for discount customers. The last option is really kind of was alluded to earlier by both, I think, Chris and Carl, looking at ways for maybe considering zero fares for a subset of customers. Most likely with the customer group that would be considered would be youth. As part of this option, obviously, we'd have to consider what the revenue impacts would be and potentially whether or not alternative funding sources would be needed to offset some of the lost fare revenue. Zero fares for youth would have kind of some benefits for families. It would improve affordability by kind of removing that financial burden of having to pay for each child. As the different discounts are evaluated, it'll be important to really consider how they impact different customer groups. There are definite trade-offs associated with the different options that I just went through. In some options, some groups will benefit, while others may not benefit, or may actually be negatively impacted. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Laura and Chris, and all of you for sticking with us. We obviously just shared a ton of information and have gotten quite a few comments and questions. So for the rest of the time, we'll end very quickly with next steps and ways to stay engaged. But for the rest of the meeting, we would like to dedicate this time to questions and answers. So on the next slide, most of you have been utilizing this Q&A box, but if you haven't yet, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask your questions and leave your comments. There's a few questions to prompt on the screen there. And for our callers who are on the phone line, those are, do you have any feedback on the conceptual options? What do you like about the options that were presented to you tonight? What do you not like or have concerns about, or other questions? So with that, Bill, I'm wondering if I can come to you with a couple questions to kick us off for this discussion. One of our participants asked, and this is a two-parter. First, how would a potential flat fee specifically impact RTD's budget and future project initiatives? And then if the total fare revenue only accounts for 8 to 12% of RTD's total revenue, why would dramatically lower fare costs impact services and service reliability?
Okay, I'll address the second one first, which is 8 to 10%. So I mean, if you think about it, if we had to reduce our operating budget 8 to 10% and we didn't have any replacement revenue, that's likely an 8 to 10% drop in service. And I think any of you have experienced our service reductions know that an 8 to 10% is a huge drop in service, and we really don't want to go there. And I think that the additional revenue is kind of outside the scope of this study. So again, we're not looking at it now. The other question was related to, well, what if you went to a flat fare? I think we're going to be looking at what that means, and that is exactly. I don't have a specific answer. I can give you a general one, or I could look to Laura. But I mean, if depending on where we set the flat fare, if we kept the flat fare as the local fare today, I think we would see a pretty significant drop in revenue, and that may impact us. If we change that flat fare and that flat fare was slightly higher, it might have some implications too. But we'll be able to test that, and we'll in our modeling to show you what the impacts of having a flat fare are on our revenues and our ridership.
Thank you, Bill. Before we move on, Laura, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging. I mean, the higher fare accounts for a couple things. I mean, obviously, it counts for the distance traveled. Also for the airport, it really accounts for a higher willingness to pay. So not thinking necessarily about airport employees, but thinking about an air traveler. You might be buying, I just bought a flight the other day that was $800 that usually is $400. So a $20 fare is round trip is not as significant for those one-off trips. And we understand with like airport employees, there's kind of other things to be thinking about. But there's a lot of things that play as we think about what groups would be impacted, and really also not trying to price out any of those shorter distance trips, because one of the things we definitely also heard was a lot of concerns about the cost of shorter distance trips and trying to bring down the fare for that. And so if we end up, as we're exploring the trade-offs and we find that the fare might actually need to increase from $3 in order to go to a flat fare without really impacting service negatively, that's going to have a detrimental impact on the majority of RTD's riders, because the majority of them are local riders. So
thank you, Laura, for adding that additional context, and Bill for the response. For this next one, Chris, I wonder if you might be able to respond. And I know we have discussed that seeking additional revenue avenues is a bit outside of this scope, but we are getting quite a few questions about that topic. So I wonder if you might be able to respond to this question. According to previous annual comprehensive financial reports, only a small portion of revenue is generated from fares. There are also costs associated with maintaining and enforcing a fare system. Is switching to a free fare system for all riders supported by a slightly higher sales tax rate something that's being seriously considered? And if so, approximately, this gets a little deep into sales tax knowledge, Chris, but approximately how much of an increase would it need to be?
Yeah, sorry, we don't know on that. But at this point, it is per Colorado's Tabor requirements. In order to increase the sales tax for RTD, we would have to go out to the voters for that. So it's not something that our board of directors has really indicated any appetite for, at least in the near term. But yeah, I'm sorry, we don't have a good answer on what the increase would have to be to make up for that loss. Now, just want to put out there though, so it's kind of counter to everything we've said. In the month of August, through a state grant that was provided to us, we will have 0 fares through the month of August, but that is being backed up by the state. And of course, that is just kind of a one-time for this, well, for the period of August. So when we have our peak ozone bad air quality days.
Thanks, Chris. Bill, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, just to build on what Chris said, and this is something we've actually are addressing as part of the Reimagine RTD process, is forecasting our future revenues. And it's not a pretty picture for RTD. We have some real challenges with providing this level of service that people come to expect. And, looking at basically even things with like eliminating our Tabor requirement, which is basically coming due in 2024, is going to have a significant impact on our ability to provide service. So there are a lot of other factors at play, and again, we're not looking as part of this to kind of completely eliminate the fare revenue just because they just don't think that that's kind of in the picture. And like Chris said, our board, it really is dependent upon the voters in our district to approve a sales tax. And I'll just say this as somebody who's been in the district and worked in the district for almost 20 years. I mean, I don't think we are in a position right now to get a very favorable response from the voters on a sales tax increase. So that's a challenge for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Chris, for your answers for that tough but very interesting question. I see we've got a hand raised from one of our participants, but before we go to them, Laura, I wonder if I can come to you for this. You answered in your presentation the original question, but one of our participants had a follow-up, kind of specifically looking at how the monthly pass works. Could you share with the group what the technical limitations preventing 24-hour passes or 30-day passes are? It seems like RTD is one of, if not the only major transit systems in the US that has been unable to do this so far.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, part of why RTD has historically not had, for example, like a rolling 30-day pass is the way that RTD actually collects fares. So RTD uses kind of a flash paper pass, which isn't conducive to being a rolling pass, because how would you indicate when the start of that pass works? Rolling passes are really common, for example, on mag stripe passes where people actually like swipe them through. So if you've been in New York City, like the Metro pass is a swipe. They have them kind of in other regions as well. And so RTD never had that. So it makes it really kind of difficult, because those passes are great for rolling because, depending on when that customer buys it and when they use it, it all starts and is managed electronically. With fare capping, some agencies have implemented a 30-day rolling pass. It creates a lot of confusion among customers because it's really hard to figure out, when did I actually achieve my cap, and when does my kind of new like monthly pass that I have achieved, when does that expire? And so there's a lot of communication that needs to happen, and part of that is kind of future kind of roadmap items for RTD's fare collection vendor. Right now, it won't necessarily say, you know, oh, it will expire on such and such date on the website. And so there's going to be a lot of confusion. And so a lot of the agencies that have implemented those, it hasn't been very successful, and they kind of wish that they had done a calendar-based pass, and in some cases have switched. There are a number of agencies. I think the other part was really about the 24-hour pass. You know, there is a number of agencies that do 24-hour passes. Again, you have a lot of issues with fare capping and trying to explain to someone when their fare cap will expire. It gets extra complicated because you're not going to have, you know, on right now, if you bought a day pass on the vehicle, it will tell you when does it expire. And so how do you handle that with electronic fares? And then those types of passes also can create a lot of conflict with operators, as they have to explain, like, I get you bought your pass and, you know, you missed your last bus, and so, but now you're outside of the 24 hours. So it can create kind of some challenges. And I think as RTD really leans into technology and leans into the new account-based ticketing system, there's also the strong desire to not create, you know, a 24-hour day pass for paper and a rolling or a service day pass for account-based ticketing and fare capping. So that was kind of, there's a lot of, yes, you could potentially do it, but it's going to be a really difficult thing to explain.
Thank you, Laura. I have a few more typed in questions that I want to get to first. I'm going to put this one out. This is a fun question, so I'm going to just put it out to the whole team to respond. But one of our participants asked, have you considered half fare days, such as for Taste of Colorado or other Colorado events, to get more people to events and keep them off the roads, especially since parking is so difficult? The potential increase in riders could help to offset the lower fare.
And I'll take that. You know, I think the one challenge for us is implementing a half price to reduced price fare day or fare month is a pretty big, tall order for us, because we have to, from the people who deal with our fare ticketing machines to the bus drivers to everybody else, and you have to go through a process, and there's quite a bit of ramp up. So unfortunately, doing those for one-off events is not probably going to be typical. Like Chris said, we are doing the free fare August. And again, we're gearing up for that now, and we should be ready come August 1st, cross our fingers, that, you know, we'll be able to see that. But doing it on one-off events, the only exception to that is we do things like offer free fares for New Year's Eve. And some other things like that, I think that, you know, are special things. I think that the board has also considered doing it on things like, you know, election day, having free fares on election day. So there are things like that, but doing it for one-off events is not going to be in the cards.
Thank you, Bill. Certainly an interesting thing to consider, and happy to hear that there's other things that are already in the works. For this next one, I wonder, Chris, if I can read this back to you. A participant said, RTD absolutely needs to have more consistent and reliable schedules. How might this proposal impact this need?
In terms of the service that is out there, as we noted earlier, it is our intent to keep the fares at such a level that we are at least able to maintain what's out there. And that is part of the reason that, you know, we are not at this point evaluating the possibility of zero fares, just because we do know that that would require a reduction in service, and recognizing that, you know, as the questionnaire is already implied, we don't have as much service out there now as we did pre-pandemic. So, you know, anything we can do to keep at least the level we're at now, as opposed to a reduction, is the kind of what our mission is at this point.
Thanks, Chris.
I was going to add to that, Kaylee, just because, you know, one of our primary issues right now is our operator issue. Many of you know that we've had challenges with operators, and that really is impacting our reliability. There's several questions about reliability of service, and, you know, one of the things that we are trying to do is change our ways. We've recently had a new CBA to increase our operating pay. So hopefully we'll get an increase in drivers and be able to kind of increase the reliability, because we want to have the dropped runs that we do today. And we apologize for our customers that rely on us and the impacts. The other piece of that is our long-term or shorter-term kind of plan for service through our Reimagine process. is going to our board next month. And that will be kind of set the plan for the future, which we think is a sustainable fiscally and workforce, depending on how our workforce responds to kind of our new CBA and other factors outside in the economy.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. We've got time for just one more question. We want to make sure we leave everyone with next steps and ways to stay engaged. For this one, Carl, we're getting quite a few questions in the Q&A box about safety. I know this is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds as people return to a new normal and to working downtown. Fare enforcement in general, or the lack thereof, specifically on light rail or rail, an airport train, impacting service. Is this something that's being looked at or being improved, or do you have any thoughts or comments on safety for our riders?
I'm curious to know, it's a great question as we think about safety. I know there's a lot of different initiatives that our Office of Security is moving forward with, and I'm kind of wavering on how to respond because I don't know the specific question that's being asked. Is there more clarity on that question?
Yeah, this one here, I guess we're trying to sum up a few of the questions that we've received. So specifically asking about a lack of enforcement on light rail or airport train affecting service. If this can be improved through more consistent fare collection or turnstiles or other methods that RTD has employed.
I will open it up to the team if there are additional responses to that.
Okay, I'll take the lifeline if you want. One thing I'll say about fare enforcement, and this may not resonate with many people, actually, and I just heard our chief of police talk about it, is that, actually, when they do their fare checks, they actually still have a fairly high acceptance rate, meaning that when they check the fares, I think it's somewhere between 92% of when they do a fare check that people have their paid fare. So there is a relatively low percentage, even though people may not see it. I do think you do see, because of our issues with not having enough, I think we'd love to have more security officers out there. Like I said earlier about our workforce issues. If we had that, we might be able to do more frequent. And I think that there's a certain comfort level from people to seeing that happen. And when they don't see it happen, they just assume the worst. And unfortunately, it's not always the case, because actually we do have a fair amount of people that do obey and do pay their fares. But safety is a big issue for us. And just generally, I would say, like Carl said, there's a lot of initiatives, and it's not just an RTD issue. I think you recognize it's a societal issue, and that really we are trying to work with partners outside of transit, with the cities, with the nonprofits, with the homeless service providers, with all these different people that are dealing with these issues that we're having as a society right now. And it really is affecting transit, and we know that, but we know it's not just ours to solve by ourselves.
Yeah, and I would also offer up too, just thinking about our community partners, whether we're partnering with nonprofit organizations, especially as it relates to folks that are houseless or experiencing houselessness. And then in addition to that, just thinking about, we are the first in the country that have assigned mental health counselors, where we have a number of mental health counselors on our team to be able to support folks that are experiencing these types of mental health crises, if you will. And then there's also, as our outreach goes with different community partners throughout the service district, there's different ambassadors, if you will, to triage different elements or occurrences on our system. So instead of just a transit security model, we're expanding beyond that to take a holistic view of how do we address the concerns within our community and being able to meet the need as it relates to the safety component and security component. So.
Thank you both. I did my best to try to cut and paste quite a few questions we were getting into one, because I wanted to get through all of them, but I really appreciate your answer. We want to make sure we leave you all with next steps and ways to stay engaged. So on the screen in front of you, just want to say again, thank you to all of our presenters and the team for tonight's discussion. And more importantly, thank you to all of you who have consistently showed up to support and engage in this process. Your feedback is clearly very valuable, and we hope that you're leaving this meeting with your questions answered. Next week on Wednesday, June 29th, we will be hosting a meeting in Spanish where all of this information will be shared once more to our Latinx community members. The link to register for the Spanish meeting is on the website, and in just a moment, I'll drop that in the chat box. After that, we will be back in front of the community in the fall for another round of community engagement that will include a second survey, 2 more customer and community meetings hosted in Spanish and in English, as well as more opportunities to stay engaged. Between now and then, I encourage you all to check out the project website that we dropped in the chat earlier to stay up to date on the latest with this process. There, you'll find resources such as the project fact sheet, FAQs, information about the project's 3 feedback panels, community partner efforts, and much more. Resources are also available in numerous languages. We'll also be posting the meeting minutes, recording, and presentation from tonight's and next week's meetings. We're so happy to see that many of you joined us for a second time this evening, but if you missed the first meeting, you can also find the meeting materials from that last round of engagement on the website now. At the beginning of the meeting, I promised to share resources to stay engaged for our participants on the phone. Unfortunately, we live in a society where some of our neighbors do not have access to reliable internet connection or internet capable device. As we are leading with equity every step of the way for this study, we want to ensure that above all else, this process is accessible to all. If you'd like to leave a comment or a question, or for any of you whose comment or question was not answered tonight, if you want more information, you can call the customer care line at 303-299-6000. Again, that number is 303-299-6000. Members of the customer care team can assist you in answering your questions and connecting you to the project team. I'll also leave the email in the chat box. And with that, I want to thank you all for sticking with us. We're 1 minute past time, but I'd like to welcome back for one final time, Chris Quinn, to close us out. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Kaylee. Don't want to keep everybody too much over time, but again, want to emphasize we do have the meeting that's in Spanish next week. You can register for that online on our website. Even if you don't have the link to it, if you just Google RTD Fair Study, and it's the first item that pops up. So, and we do have a lot of very useful information on that, including, as Kaylee noted, the previous meetings and the ability to sign up for additional information and be kept in the know and add comments as they come along. With that, I just there again want to thank you for your participation tonight, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone.